Was Richard II a brilliant, tragically misunderstood king, or a reckless, dangerously charming fool destined to unravel the very fabric of England? Did his lavish court, brimming with youthful extravagance and unsettling intimacy, signal a glorious dawn or the ominous prelude to a devastating fall? And most importantly, could a king, obsessed with jewels and the pursuit of pleasure, truly grasp the weighty responsibilities of the throne? Let's dive into the swirling currents of 14th century England, a time of political intrigue, simmering resentments, and a young monarch desperately trying to carve his own path, a path that ultimately led to ruin. The story begins, predictably, with a silence. A deliberate, carefully constructed silence surrounding the marriage of Richard II and Anne of Bohemia. It wasn't a grand, public affair, not the kind usually associated with royal unions. Instead, it was a quiet, almost secretive ceremony, shrouded in a veil of piety. Historians whisper about a devout lay celibacy, a voluntary renunciation of marriage, a choice made by the young king and his queen. Anne, a woman known for her unwavering faith, was a pillar of virtue, and Richard, it seemed, was drawn to her unwavering devotion. It's a bizarre detail, isn't it? A king choosing a life of quiet contemplation alongside his queen, rather than the expected spectacle of a royal wedding. This wasn't a sudden decision, of course. The late 14th century was a breeding ground for unconventional unions. Chaste marriages, marriages based on mutual faith rather than political expediency, were surprisingly common among the nobility. But Richard and Anne's commitment was remarkable, a deliberate rejection of the expected. It was a statement, a subtle declaration that this king wasn't interested in the usual trappings of power, the conquests, the lavish displays, the relentless pursuit of heirs. He seemed to crave something different. Meanwhile, across the channel, a man named John of Gaunt, Richard's uncle, was simmering with discontent. He believed he was entitled to advise the king not just as the eldest surviving son of Edward III, but as the hereditary steward of England, a position that gave him considerable influence. And he wasn't alone. Richard Fitzalan, the Earl of Arundel, had been appointed by Parliament in November 1381, a move designed to give the king some external counsel. But Gaunt and Arundel, along with other powerful magnates, saw Richard's reign as a threat to their established order. They envisioned a king guided by their experience, their wisdom, their ambition. The Peasants Revolt of 1381 threw everything into chaos. Suddenly, the carefully constructed hierarchy of the medieval world was being challenged by a furious mob demanding fairer treatment, lower taxes, and an end to serfdom. Richard, still young and inexperienced, found himself facing a crisis unlike anything he'd encountered before. The revolt, brutally suppressed, left a deep scar on the kingdom and, crucially, solidified Richard's position. He had survived, emerged stronger, and began to assert his own authority. He realized he needed his own circle of advisors, people who trusted him, who shared his vision. And that's where the story gets truly fascinating. Richard wasn't drawn to the traditional, seasoned advisors. He gravitated towards the young, the energetic, the unconventional. Simon Burley and Michael de la Pole, both veterans of the Black Prince's campaigns, were among his first choices. But he also sought out figures like James Berners, John Beauchamp of Holt, and John Salisbury, young knights, brimming with potential, eager to serve a king who seemed to offer them a chance to shine. And then there was Robert de Vere, the Earl of Oxford. De Vere was a captivating figure, a whirlwind of youthful charm and reckless ambition. He'd inherited his earldom at the age of 9, and his life had been meticulously crafted by his father. He was a knight of Edward III, a favorite of the court, and now he was Richard's closest friend, a bond that would ultimately prove disastrous. His marriage to Philippa de Courcy, daughter of the Earl of Bedford, was a strategic alliance, a carefully orchestrated union designed to strengthen Richard's position. But the marriage itself was a whirlwind of youthful passion, a whirlwind that would soon be violently extinguished. The early years of Richard's reign were marked by military failures. The crusade into Flanders, spearheaded by Bishop Henry Despenser, was a spectacular disaster, a costly and pointless expedition that ended with the bishop's downfall. Yet, Richard himself hadn't led an army. He relied on his advisors, on the efforts of others, and on a fragile truce with France. He needed to demonstrate his leadership, to prove that he was more than just a pretty face and a lover of fine clothes. In 1385, Richard seized the opportunity to punish the Scots for their raids into northern England. He assembled a massive army estimated at 14,000 men and marched unopposed through the Scottish borderlands, sacking the abbeys of Dryburgh and Melrose. It was a display of force, a calculated assertion of English power, and it worked. Richard returned a triumphant hero, rewarded with new titles and promotions. He elevated his father's former allies, Edmund of Langley to the Dukedom of York and Thomas of Woodstock to the Duchy of Gloucester. He showered his close associates with honors. Sir Michael de la Pole became Earl of Suffolk, and Robert de Vere was elevated to the unprecedented title of Marquess of Dublin. But there was a darker motive behind these generous gifts. Richard was clearly planning to name Roger Mortimer as his heir. Mortimer, a charismatic and ruthless nobleman, was a powerful figure in his own right, and by excluding his uncles, particularly Gaunt and Woodstock, Richard aimed to weaken their influence and consolidate his own power. It was a calculated move, a strategic maneuver designed to secure his legacy. Richard's court was a spectacle, a dazzling display of wealth and extravagance. He was obsessed with fashion, with jewels, with creating a world of beauty and pleasure. He commissioned magnificent tapestries, rebuilt the Great Hall at Westminster Palace with a breathtaking hammer-beam ceiling, and even invented the pocket handkerchief, a small piece of linen for wiping his nose. It was a court that some described as sophisticated, theatrical, and even decadent. But beneath the glittering surface, tensions were brewing. The Salisbury Parliament of 1384 marked a turning point. Richard Fitzalan, the Earl of Arundel, launched a scathing attack on the king's governance, accusing him of mismanagement and extravagance. Richard's response was explosive. According to the Westminster Chronicle, he turned white with anger and then, with a terrifying intensity, challenged Arundel. "If it is to my charge that you would lay this, and it is supposed to be my fault that there is misgovernment in the kingdom, you lie in your teeth. You can go to the devil." He followed up with a similar outburst when Archbishop of Canterbury admonished him about his insolence, even reaching for his sword before his uncle, Thomas of Woodstock, intervened. Richard's advisors, increasingly frustrated by his autocratic behavior and his reliance on de Vere, began to voice their concerns. They saw the young king as reckless, impulsive, and dangerously out of touch with the realities of power. They feared that his lavish spending, his obsession with pleasure, and his unsettling intimacy with de Vere were undermining his authority and destabilizing the kingdom. The wonderful Parliament of 1386 was a pivotal moment. John of Gaunt, Richard's uncle and a staunch royalist, had sailed to Spain to claim the throne of Castile. His absence created a power vacuum, and the Parliament, desperate for funds to defend against a potential French invasion, demanded an unprecedented quadruple subsidy from the king. Richard, however, refused to comply, famously declaring that he would not dismiss a single scullion from his household at Parliament's request. He demonstrated his utter disdain for the Commons, refusing to attend the Parliament and appointing his favorite, de Vere, to the position of Duke of Ireland. The Parliament responded with fury. They demanded the dismissal of the king's ministers, accusing Richard of tyranny and abuse of power. Richard, enraged by this challenge to his authority, responded with a legal gambit. He questioned the very foundations of parliamentary power, redefining treason in the broadest possible terms and threatening to punish anyone who dared to oppose him. The ensuing conflict escalated into a full-blown civil war. The appellants Arundel, Warwick, Mowbray, and Derby rose up against Richard, demanding his deposition. The battle at Radcot Bridge was a disaster for de Vere, who was cut down in battle. Richard, forced to flee to the Tower of London, was effectively stripped of his power. The wonderful parliament ultimately led to Richard's deposition and the accession of his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, later Henry IV. Richard II, once a promising young king, was imprisoned and eventually died in captivity, a victim of his own ambition and his court's excesses. Looking back, it's easy to see the seeds of Richard's downfall. His youthful exuberance, his obsession with pleasure, and his reliance on a single, charismatic advisor, Vere, created a dangerous combination. He was surrounded by ambitious men who saw him as a pawn in their own games. And he, in his naivete, allowed them to manipulate him, to exploit his weaknesses. Was Richard II a victim of circumstance, a king caught in the crosscurrents of a turbulent era? Or was he a flawed ruler whose personal failings ultimately led to his demise? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. He was undoubtedly a complex and fascinating figure, a king who defied expectations, who challenged the conventions of his time, and who ultimately paid the ultimate price for his ambition. And as we ponder his story, one final, unsettling question lingers. Could a king, so captivated by beauty and pleasure, ever truly grasp the burden of kingship?